Well, hi and good morning, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us today. We're joined this morning by Suzanne Holteen and Jackson Brainerd from the National Conference of State Legislators. My name is Jordan Krasinski, and I serve as the Director of Membership with Good Business Colorado. We're a coalition of over 250 values-driven businesses who are committed to a prosperous, equitable, and sustainable Colorado. GBC members understand that we have a role to play in shaping public policy that impacts our communities and businesses. Before we kick off today's discussion, we'd like to say a big thank you to our co-sponsoring organizations today, the African Chamber of Commerce, Be Local Colorado, Colorado Black Chamber of Commerce, the Commons on Champa, Startup Colorado, the Latino Chamber of Commerce of Pueblo, Rocky Mountain Employee Ownership Center, and Small Business Majority. Thank you all so very much for working with us to host this virtual event. After today's presentation, you'll receive an email with more information about each of our sponsoring organizations, and we encourage you to take a few moments to learn more about our amazing partners. Also included in that follow-up email is a feedback form. We appreciate you taking just a moment or two to tell us a bit about your experience on today's virtual event. And for now, I'll go ahead and pass it off to Lindsay Vagoda with Small Business Majority.
Thanks, Jordan. Hey, all, I'm Lindsay Vagoda. I'm the Colorado Outreach Manager for Small Business Majority. We're a small business education and nonprofit organization, and we're founded and run by small business owners. We're a national nonprofit with 6 offices in Washington, D.C., California, Colorado, Illinois, Maryland, Virginia, and we actually today just opened up an office in Georgia. And we focus on the top most important issues to small businesses, which include access to capital, healthcare, retirement, entrepreneurship, taxes, and a lot more. And check out our online resource hub located at venturize.org that helps you with resources and education for small business owners in key areas. Right now, I'll pass it over to Karen at Good Business Colorado.
Hey everyone, good morning. Thanks so much for joining us for this conversation. I'm just gonna do just a real quick introduction of our presenters who we're so thankful they're joining us this morning to navigate this conversation. And then I'll be back when we do some question and answer via the chat box. So as they're presenting, be thinking about the questions that you have for them and you would like to ask later on. So we're joined by Jackson Brainerd, who is a Senior Policy Specialist with the National Conference of State Legislatures. You'll probably hear us refer to it as NCSL, just for ease. He is a policy specialist in the Fiscal Affairs Program, which provides state legislators with outreach and policy analysis on a wide range of state fiscal issues with a focus on state tax and economic development policy. We're also joined by Suzanne Holteen, who is a program director in the Employment, Labor, and Retirement Program at NCSL. In this role, she oversees issues around employment, occupational licensing, and workforce development. Suzanne joined NCSL in 2013, but she's also served as the Deputy Chief of Staff for 2 Colorado Lieutenant Governors. So I'm just thrilled to have them both, and I think they have an enormous amount of expertise to really help us navigate this policy proposal and what it means for small businesses in Colorado. So I will kick it over to them.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you to Good Business Colorado for inviting us here today to talk about paid sick leave trends across the country and then dive in on Colorado's bill. So first off, for those of you who are not familiar with the National Conference of State Legislatures, we are based here in Denver. We are the bipartisan membership and professional development organization for legislators and legislative staff in all 50 states and territories. Really, our mission is threefold. We help provide information and research to state legislators and legislative staff. We really serve as an extension of their staff. We also have a small office in Washington, D.C. that lobbies on behalf of state interests at the federal level. And then really our third aspect of our mission is to bring legislators together and legislative staff to exchange ideas. Obviously, that looks a little bit different right now, but in terms of this presentation, I'm going to give you a little bit of a background in terms of what we're seeing across the country and other states, and then hand it over to Jackson. Jackson's has spent quite a few years tracking this issue, and he's going to dive into the federal legislation and then also Colorado's bill and kind of go through that a little bit. So if you could go to the next slide. Jumping right in, currently 13 states and the District of Columbia have passed laws requiring employers to provide paid sick leave to their employees. Most of these laws were passed legislatively, but in several states, Arizona, Massachusetts, and Washington, the laws were passed through ballot measure. In Michigan, the legislature passed a sick leave measure in 2018 to get out in front of a more generous paid sick leave ballot measure that was expected to pass later that year. So it's a policy that is growing not only among voters, but also in state legislatures. If you go to the next slide. So we have seen paid sick leave laws steadily increase over the last few years. The first paid sick leave law was enacted in 2011 in Connecticut, and states have gradually joined over the course of the last decade. So you can see that the policy is slowly gaining more and more public support. It is important to note that many employers already provide some sort of paid sick leave to their employees. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, 76% of American workers have had access to paid sick leave benefits as of March 2019. Next slide. So the paid sick leave laws across states are pretty similar in that you can use sick leave to care for your own illness or care for the illness of a family member, and you are paid at your full regular rate of pay. The rate of leave accrual varies, but most states set maximum requirements of about 30 to 40 hours of paid sick leave per year. Sick leave is an earned benefit, so you accrue a set amount of paid leave based on your length of employment. It is generally not available to recently laid off employees or general contractors or workers covered by collective bargaining agreements. Part-time workers are generally covered, but some states set hourly baselines. In Maryland, for example, employees need to work at least 12 hours a week to be eligible. In Michigan, they need to work more than 25 hours a week. Next slide. This is a pretty dense slide, so we can move this up for a second. But here's a summary of the state sick leave coverage and accrual rates. States vary in terms of who constitutes a covered employer. In some states, all employers are required to provide paid sick leave, although about half the states with paid sick leave laws have created exemptions for smaller businesses, although the thresholds of these do vary. So some states have exemptions for specific types of businesses or industries. For example, Connecticut exempts certain manufacturers and tax-exempt organizations from its law. Vermont doesn't require new employers to comply with paid sick leave requirements until 1 year after hiring their first employee. And all of the existing paid sick leave laws are mandates for employers. The states do not compensate businesses for providing this benefit. And why don't we go on to the next slide, please? So what are we seeing in terms of 2020 activity? Well, as previously mentioned, paid sick leave had been building up a lot of steam in recent years and in recent legislative sessions. So it seemed likely that there would be a lot of enactments this year. However, due to the coronavirus, it's really had a huge impact on the operations of legislatures recently. Most of the state legislatures were in session when the coronavirus started spreading. And so many of the legislatures were interrupted, had to pause or end quickly. And then also given the economy and where state finances are looking right now, some priorities have changed. The states that did introduce the states that did have paid sick leave laws in place prior to 2020 have been able to put these to use during the pandemic. But in the states that it introduced legislation this year, it wasn't really part of the initial response to the virus. And I think largely that is because the federal government was able to step in and provide paid sick leave, which Jackson will address here shortly. But so there hasn't been as much movement on paid sick leave over the last few months. In addition to Colorado, there are 12 states that have considered paid sick leave legislation. Most, not all, but most of the measures were introduced before the pandemic hit, and none have passed so far. We expect that it's likely to see an increase in paid sick leave proposals over the next few years. The reason why many states don't have paid sick leave currently is primarily due to concerns around the potential impact it would have on employers. But in the current environment, paid sick leave is quickly becoming a public health issue as much as an economics issue. There are risks that come with having people show up to work sick if they can't afford to take an absence. And we imagine this will become a priority in a handful of states in the coming years. One other thing that I want to mention, and one of the reasons why this could become a trend in the coming years, is that we are seeing at the federal level some provided safety nets and additional benefits over the last few months. And I think states might start asking why we can't do this at the state level. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jackson.
Thanks, Suzanne. And on the topic of the economic impact, we're not economists, so we can't really speak to the effect that this will have on small businesses. Precisely, it's a lot like the minimum wage issue in that you can find studies that say it has a positive overall economic impact, a negative, or a neutral. So, for example, the Center on Economic and Policy Research conducted a survey of 251 Connecticut employers a few years after their paid leave law went into effect, and most reported a modest or no increase in costs or business operations and minimal administrative burdens and improved employee morale. Another think tank, the Employment Policies Institute, conducted a separate survey of 156 Connecticut employers and found that a small number of businesses had to raise prices or lay off employees or convert part-time positions to full-time positions, but about 20% or so said they'd reduce hiring in the future and more worried about unscheduled absences. So the Urban Institute, which is a Brookings-esque organization, reviewed 23 different paid sick leave studies that had been published over a 10-year period between 2008 to 2018. Their review of the literature generally found that employer implementation was not overly burdensome, but that access to paid sick time does lower rates of presenteeism at the workplace. So the weight of the evidence seems to suggest that statewide paid sick leave doesn't have a significantly negative impact, but that does not mean that some businesses aren't going to face challenges or be forced to take steps like reducing pay or increasing prices to deal with the increased labor costs, especially if the economy doesn't rebound as quickly as some are predicting. Next slide, please. So as Suzanne mentioned, Congress passed a temporary paid sick leave measure in April as part of the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. It requires certain employers to provide paid sick leave to employees who are sick, need to quarantine or self-isolate, or care for a sick or quarantined family member, or care for a child whose school has been closed by a public official. The paid sick leave requirement does not apply to employers with more than 500 employees, and the Secretary of the Department of Labor is permitted to issue regulations exempting businesses with fewer than 50 employees from the paid leave requirement if it, quote, would jeopardize the viability of the business as a going concern. Full-time employees under the federal law are eligible for 80 hours of sick leave under this new emergency leave program. Part-time workers will be granted time off that is equivalent to their scheduled or normal work hours. Subsequently, employers with similar existing paid sick leave policies can't require a worker to use other available paid leave before using that sick time. Employers were also prohibited from requiring a worker to find replacement coverage for their hours during their time off, or firing or discriminating against workers for requesting to use that paid sick leave. Unlike paid leave laws, though the financial burden of providing that paid leave is not left to employers, the federal measure created a refundable tax credit that will cover the wages that are paid to employees while they're taking time off. The credits are against the employer's payroll and retirement tax payments. Sick leave credit for each employee is for wages of as much as $511 per day while the employee is in quarantine. Employees can furthermore be given $200 if they are caring for someone else who has been quarantined, or if they have to take care of their child because their school's been closed due to the virus. The family leave credit for each employee is capped at $200 per day, while also receiving paid sick leave. Next slide, please. So before I get into Senate Bill 205 in Colorado, I just want to note that when it comes to wage and hour laws, federal law serves as the national baseline for worker protections. Similar to minimum wage, states are allowed to adopt more generous policies for workers or more stringent requirements from employers if there's not an explicit preemption. Senate Bill 205 has two main components. The first is to build off of the federal paid sick leave law I just mentioned and require that all employers, regardless of size, must provide the 14 days or 80 hours of sick time provided for by federal law. So that means that the employers with more than 500 employees, which were exempted, are now compelled to comply via state law. They wouldn't be eligible for the offsetting tax credit. I'm not sure what this means for the businesses with fewer employees, with fewer than 50 employees, as far as whether it make it pointless for them to seek a federal exemption or if they'd be compelled to comply by state law as well. Then the bill also includes, starting January 2021, a new universal paid sick leave requirement. Employees will accrue 1 hour of paid sick leave for every 30 hours worked, up to 48 hours of paid sick leave over a 12-month period, so that's 6 work days in a year. The majority of states with paid sick leave laws have similar accrual rates. Most states only allow workers to accrue 5 days of leave per year instead of 6, so Colorado's is slightly more generous in that regard. For employees that are not covered by overtime protections, usually white-collar occupations, they accrue leave as if they were working 40 hours a week. Employees who work less than 40 hours per week accrue leave based on the number of hours that comprise an average work week. Employees start accruing sick leave when they begin employment, and it can be taken as it is accrued. Workers can carry over unused hours from 1 year to the next, but employers are not required to let them take more than 48 hours in a 12-month period. Employers are also not required to pay out any unused sick leave when a worker separates from employment. However, they do have to, if an employee leaves and is rehired within a year, the employers have to reinstate any sick leave that the employee had accrued. If ownership of a business changes, but the employees remain on board, they get to keep the sick leave that they've accrued. And employers that are already offering comparable paid leave benefits are not required to provide anything. And again, this is applicable to employers of all sizes in the state. Next slide, please. So reasons for leave. Employees can use sick leave for several reasons under this bill. If they are unable to work due to a mental or physical injury or illness, or they need to seek diagnosis or treatment for that injury or illness. They can take leave if they need to care for a family member who has a mental or physical injury or needs to seek treatment for it. They can take leave if the employee or the family member has been the victim of domestic abuse, sexual assault, or harassment and needs to take an absence for reasons related to such a crime. And they can also take leave if a public official has issued an order to close schools that an employee's child goes to, or if the employee's place of business is closed. So for the purposes of caring for a family member, the bill also defines family member to mean the following: either immediate family, someone who's related by blood, marriage, civil union, or adoption. It can mean a child to whom the employee has had legal responsibilities for, or someone who stood in loco parentis for the employee when the employee was a minor, or a person who the employee has lived with for more than 6 months. Next slide, please. So on the whole, this proposal isn't notably different from the other states that have enacted paid sick leave laws. However, one unique feature is that the bill also requires employees to provide additional paid sick leave during a public health emergency for reasons similar to the ones that are covered by the federal emergency paid sick leave law. This seems designed to deal with a potential second wave of the coronavirus or another pandemic. It requires employers to provide full-time employees with at least 80 hours of additional paid sick leave, although they'd have to use other accrued sick leave first. For employees that are not full-time, they'd receive paid leave in an amount that is equivalent to the number of hours they typically work over a 2-week period. So it's not substantially different from the federal emergency sick leave provisions, really, except there's no offsetting tax credit. So that does seem like it could pose problems for some businesses if such a public health emergency ever does come to pass in the future. Next slide, please. Some other items employers should know: the bill contains a number of other enforcement provisions that are worth being aware of. Some of them still need to be developed via regulation by the Department of Labor and Employment, which the bill provides for. So it gets into employee rights. There are several provisions pertaining to the rights of employees to access this leave and ensuring their ability to use it. Employees can use sick leave in hourly increments. Employers can't require workers to find a replacement to cover their shift as a condition for taking leave. Employers can also not require details relating to domestic violence or sexual assault, or seek details regarding an employee or family member's health information. There are some anti-retaliation provisions as well. Employers are not allowed to retaliate or take discriminatory action towards employees for use or attempted use of paid sick leave, and there are a number of legal enforcements and penalties to prevent this from occurring that I won't get into. There are also notification requirements, both on the employee and the employer side. For employees, when the need to take sick leave is foreseeable, they need to make a good faith effort to provide advance notice to employers. Employers, for their part, must notify employees that they are entitled to sick leave and that employers can't prevent workers from taking sick leave under state law. So this would require supplying every employee with some kind of written notice and displaying a poster in a conspicuous location in each establishment that your employees work. There are also record-keeping requirements. Employers must retain records for each employee for a 3-year period, documenting the hours worked, the amount of paid sick leave accrued and used, and if any issue arises concerning an employee's right to paid sick leave and the employer hasn't been keeping records, they'll be presumed to have violated the law. So in other states, some of these administrative requirements have presented difficulties for small businesses. A survey of Seattle businesses after a local paid sick leave ordinance went into effect found that employers tended to cite some common challenges, including initial difficulties with working with payroll vendors to report accrued time, understanding all the legal requirements of the law, and keeping records to comply with the ordinance. So could behoove employers to try to get out in front of some of these issues if possible, and it definitely would behoove the state to do some educational outreach once this is implemented and provide more robust guidance. Usually in the states that have passed, the biggest issue with business compliance is just simply being unaware or unaware of the law or being confused about what the requirements are. So that's our summary of this bill. Again, it's still in committee and would require some additional guidance and regulation, but happy to try to answer any questions.
Thank you so much. That was a great summary. I think my colleague Hunter at Small Business Majority is going to kick us off with questions. Just want to remind folks, I believe all of your lines are muted, but we are keeping a really close eye on the chat box. So now's a great time to start typing in your questions, and we will go through those. Hunter and I will go through the chat box and be sure we get all your questions to presenters. We do hope that folks think through sort of what this could mean for your business. And if you have any questions about what this could look like, please, now's the time to ask.
Thank you for that presentation. So I think just to start, especially given the current business environment, so you had mentioned that there hasn't been a whole lot of business impact in states that have already implemented that. I was just hoping to, by starting off, maybe just expanding a little bit more on what that impact might look like. And then also, if you have some sense or there's research out there, what additional challenges this might present, given that I think other states have rolled their program out, and what we can we'll just call it normal times, for lack of a better term.
Definitely. So I guess some of the challenges that businesses might face, at least what they've reported they've had to deal with in the past, are that's increasing prices, lowering employee pay, converting part-time positions to full-time, or laying off employees, decreasing vacation time, potentially relocating employees, and then obviously in the worst case scenario, having to shut down a place of business, or limiting a business expansion. And as far as what the differences between enacting this law and this during this pandemic, it is unprecedented, and all of the paid sick leave laws up till now were passed during the recovery from the Great Recession. So no states implemented a law like this during economic serious downtimes that I'm aware of.
And just as a quick follow-up too, because I mean, I think this is something that comes up with price increases, lower pay, FTE to part-time, cutting benefits. How, just to give folks a sense of the scope or how widespread that was, like those impacts were pretty moderate, weren't they? At least in the assessed states.
Yes, but it did depend on the study. So for example, I cited some Connecticut surveys, but they have a threshold limit for it. The law doesn't apply to employers with fewer than 50 employees, so can skew the results there.
Okay.
But in general,
Thank you.
modest impacts generally reported.
So here's a great question about some of the confidentiality provisions in the Colorado legislation as it's proposed. So can you clarify around confidentiality, and essentially the question is, can employers ask for documentation of the reason for the leave? It sounds like folks understand that the sexual assault and domestic violence provisions, they would not be allowed to ask that information. But my reading is that the confidentiality pieces are really for any health issue, not just sex assault and domestic violence. Is that correct? And can employers ask for documentation in general for the reason for the leave?
That was how I read it as well. And there are also additional provisions there that say if you do have any health information on the employee, that you have to keep it in a separate file, and it has to be treated as confidential medical health records. But yeah, I also read it as prohibiting employers from requesting specific information from the employees.
So employment benefits and specifically leave benefits in Colorado have been a pretty prevalent issue at the state capitol for some years now. I was just hoping, since I know a lot of folks on this call have been either working or aware of the paid family leave measure, and now we're hearing about sick time, and I think you had some language distinguishing those two, but like how would these two interact conceivably, and are there states that currently have both, and how does that play out?
A lot of the states have both, but they're separate programs. So the paid family leave is usually funded by a payroll tax on employees in the states that have those laws. So definitely more challenging for Colorado to implement something like that with the tax component, given Tabor's limitations. But the paid family leave provides benefits. The wage replacement rate is usually less than the full rate, but the amount of leave provided is usually in the 6 to 12 week range, and all the sick leave laws are around 4 to 5 days of leave. So different circumstances. Yeah, usually, obviously, family and medical leave tends to apply to new mothers and fathers who need to take time off. That's where the vast majority of those leave takers come from.
And I think it sounds too, because I think a lot of the conversation specifically with this group of businesses has been around how the funds are administered, and paid sick would be accrued and paid out of the employer, whereas paid family leave, at least as it's been administered in several other states, there's like an insurance pool that they pay into.
Exactly.
So we have a question, and this is kind of about a specific industry, but like a staffing company that's not currently offering sick or vacation. I think just the broader question would be, they're asking, are they required? So just want to confirm that essentially all employers of all sizes are required, and there's not any sort of proposed carve-outs or exemptions in the bill as it's currently drafted.
So the bill defines employers as anyone covered by the Federal Fair Labor Standards Act. So I'm not sure how staffing agencies fall under that law, but that's how they are defining it. So there are exemptions for employers in the Federal Fair Labor Standards Act, but they're specified there.
Thanks for clarifying.
So especially with this paid leave, and I think this kind of makes sense with, or it's a little bit easier to figure out if you have employees and how this kind of works, but how does this work for self-employed individuals? Like, are there additional requirements? Because I think specifically, at least earlier iterations of the bill draft in Colorado had a 1 to 49 or like designated employment caps for different provisions of the law. And I think what we found, especially with loan programs and everything that's going on with the crisis, that self-employed you are the employee of your business. So how does this change anything? Is there anything that folks should be aware of if they fit that category?
I don't believe it applies to the independent contractors or self-employed, so that shouldn't change anything on their end.
Okay.
So we have a question coming in around how does this connect if you already have paid time off? And I think there could be a few things to unpack here, because some employers do structure this as paid time off, which may include both sick days as well as vacation days. They're just all sort of lumped together. You get your time and use it how you want. So can you talk through, I guess it's kind of a two-part question, what sort of payroll changes would be required? Because it seems that to be sure that you're in compliance with the paid sick days, you would have to start tracking those separately. And what sort of additional requirements would be needed to make sure that a current internal policy is in compliance with the state law?
I think that one, you need to wait for more guidance. I don't think I can weigh in on that side of things, but yeah, if you can show that your leave policy is substantially similar, however the state might see that, then you would be good to go. But as far as leave policies that lump them together, I'm not sure how the state would view that.
So I think another piece of this that I think jumps out and on paper looks scary, but I think you had mentioned that some of this has to go in rules, but there's an anti-retaliation piece where effectively the employer cannot take retaliatory measures against the employee within 90 days. How does that, I think there's two parts to this question. One, in the current crisis where folks have had to furlough or terminate employment for public health reasons, how is that kind of overlapped? And then I think just in the normal course of doing this, I think there's, the law doesn't really have specified language for maybe the employer isn't terminating an employee in retaliation, but maybe they have another cause for doing that, and how does that play out in other states?
That's a good question. I am not sure how the state would be able to differentiate the businesses need to cut jobs versus retaliatory actions. In other states, again, that's not unfortunately not something that I'm aware of that states have been dealing with.
I appreciate that.
With kind of the language in other states in terms of the retaliatory language, just how their bills are, even their rules are. We could be happy to dive a little deeper into that if you'd like.
So another question about how this all applies. So we know that some employers kind of cross state lines. So the question is, does this apply only to an employer who is based in Colorado, or to employees that work in Colorado? And what about large employers who are not based in Colorado, but may have some staff here? So what are your thoughts on how this is constructed, across kind of state lines, when folks may be living in one place, but working in Colorado, based in California, but they've got a team here, that sort of thing?
I think I don't want to say for sure, because again, there's going to have to be additional guidance on this front. But generally, if the employee is located in the state, then they would be eligible for that sick leave. It wouldn't matter where the employer is headquartered necessarily.
So I think there's a question here, and I think this is kind of another area where I think the Colorado law, I can't speak relative to the other states, but there's pretty broad set reasons where you can take this type of leave, but on the other hand, the employer cannot ask for like documentation. So like, how does I guess that given, are there states that I guess to give you something that you can actually dig into a little bit rather than answering vague questions about a bill that's still in the process, how have states kind of sought to manage this employee providing a reasonable need for paid leave to their employer, and kind of balancing that with the retaliation piece? Because I think that kind of, to me, this sounds like this puts employers in a very difficult position, and I don't think anybody on this call really, I think folks,
Sure.
What we've seen is they want to be able to provide this benefit, but they also have to be able to do this in a way that is clear for everybody.
And I would say that it's in the other states, just to at least give you a little bit of peace of mind, the reported cases of employee abuse of this program is pretty minimal in most of the states. Of all those employer surveys that I mentioned, are even the ones where they're reporting negative impacts on their bottom lines, not necessarily reporting widespread abuse of the program. But it varies by state in terms of how they're able to balance that. In some of them, the requirements for employees providing more advance notice are a little bit more fleshed out. But that's just a problem inherent in the laws, I think, balancing that confidentiality piece with the employer's ability to get information about their employee taking leave. Yeah.
So I think we've gotten through a lot of the questions in the chat box, but folks continue to ask your questions. I have a couple just to make sure that I'm understanding it correctly. So sort of two-part, the federal tax credits that are specific to the coronavirus, those, am I correct that those expire at the end of the year, December 31st, yes. 2020? And we just don't know if the feds are going to extend those or not, if that would make sense. The part of the bill of Senate Bill 205 that creates this essentially 2 weeks for full-time employees related to a public health, pandemic, that's just in perpetuity? Is there a timeline? There's not a, it's just from now on, if we have Ebola or anything, this is what it gets triggered.
Yes. And hopefully in such an instance, the federal government would be able to step in again so that businesses are not having to provide 2 weeks of leave despite having to be closed down. So, difficult provision.
I think this is kind of another question for, and we're throwing some very difficult ones out right now. So currently and I think this is more about other states as well, but currently if a business got a PPP loan or some sort of federal assistance for their business, at least from what we hear, given, and this is also a very moving target on the lending side, is that they may not be able to claim the tax credits for the federal paid sick days under the CARES Act. Has that impacted, or have you heard anything about coming out of other states where this has been an issue, or is that just is it too soon to tell, or that is it just a convoluted mess right now?
The PPP, as far as I understand it, is it's a pretty big mess right now. So yeah, there's a lot of guidance still around that program that needs to be issued. So yeah, I'm not sure.
I appreciate that.
And one more question that I just received via text. Just wanting you to clarify again how the rollover and accrual works from years to year. I believe you said that it doesn't sort of accrue from year to year, but just wanted to clarify.
It does. Piece. It does. You can roll it over year to year, but the employee or the employer is not required to allow the employee to take more than 48 hours in a 12-month period. So even if they have more in the bank, they don't have to allow them to take more.
And is it the employer doesn't have to pay out more than that amount? Or that's okay. So essentially you can accrue it, but the employer still only has to pay out the 6 days a year.
Yeah.
Correct?
Yeah.
So for all intents and purposes, it's not exactly accruing since they still only have to pay the 6 days, right?
Yes. Well, it's up to but if the employer is generous about it, then they would be able to.
Then they could. Gotcha. Go ahead, Hunter.
Oh, I was going to say, so we just got a question, and I think this is given the issues around the emergency components. So this question is, who decides if there's a public health emergency? And then I think just given, I mean, right now this is obviously very much a public health emergency, but how has this public health emergencies been declared in the past relative to, let's just say, less deadly illnesses? And like, basically, are we going to be having to do 14 days paid sick leave in perpetuity every time flu season runs around, or is there a higher standard that would constitute an emergency?
That I'm not sure of, but I mean, generally the people who have been issuing these orders are executives. I think at the local level, you could also have mayors doing it. Suzanne, do you have any?
Yeah, I think the bill says local, state, or federal public official. So it could be any level that issues it.
I can't see folks wanting to shut down the economy again over the flu, though. So hopefully that doesn't.
Sure.
So another sort of clarification question that came up earlier, but so at termination, the employer, is it correct that the employer does not have to pay out sick days or pay out accrual of sick days upon termination?
Correct. Yep.
Yeah. So it's like you have them when you're working there, when you're not working
Once
there.
you're gone, then you don't.
Yeah. And I think that could be an interesting thing for employers, again, to have to work with their payroll companies about, because I believe that our wage law in Colorado, you do have to pay out unused vacation days. So those are going to have to be differentiated a little bit to make sure you're sort of paying out what you need to. And yeah,
that sounds right.
So I think we're sort of getting to the end of our questions. We do have a few more minutes if anybody has anything else. There was a request if you could clarify again the 1099, just because folks do have 1099 contractors. So I don't know if there's any sort of final clarifications around obligations for 1099 workers. But then I think we can start getting ready to wrap up unless we see any other questions pop in.
Barring any other guidance to the contrary after this continues to move, the independent contractors wouldn't be covered by this.
Or not covered.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you. And just a follow up to that, just when you've looked at other states, have you seen any unintended consequences of where maybe part-time employees are sort of become 1099 workers so that their employers don't have to pay out? Or has there been any tracking of that sort of employee classification changing when these laws go into effect?
Not that I'm aware of, but around the margins, it wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah.
But nothing that I've seen well published. publicized?
I think generally there's been some concern in states that potentially more employers could be moving people to 1099s, not just around paid sick leave, but vacation, other benefits. And so, as I mentioned earlier, I think one thing that this coronavirus might bring up more conversations in states is just about support systems and portable benefits for contract workers. And so I imagine over the next few years, there'll be more and more conversations about that.
Yeah, that's great. It certainly seems that as, our workforce has really changed and people intuitively understand the need for portable benefits more and more because people just don't stay at the same job for their entire career anymore. Yeah. Well, thank you all for this conversation. I think it was really interesting. I know there's a lot of moving pieces. It's a 21-page bill, so a lot of components of it. I did put in the chat box a link to the actual bill if folks want to take a look at it. And this is something that is Good Business Colorado and Small Business Majority are really engaged in these conversations. We want to be sure that our small businesses understand the bill and how it would work and what it would mean for them. And we're certainly open to your questions and comments and taking that feedback back to legislators. So we so appreciate NCSL for walking us through sort of the technical components and how this fits in the national landscape. So I'm going to kick it over to Deborah to close us out around kind of survey and anything like that.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Karen. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us, to our amazing presenters from NCSL. Thank you so much to our event sponsors, the African Chamber of Commerce, Be Local Colorado, the Colorado Black Chamber of Commerce, the Latino Chamber of Commerce of Pueblo, the Rocky Mountain Employee Ownership Center, the Commons on Champa, Small Business Majority, Startup Colorado. And thank you so much to Karen and Jordan from the Good Business Colorado team and Hunter and Lindsay from Small Business Majority for pulling this event together. You're gonna get a survey as soon as we wrap in a little bit, and we'd really appreciate it if you could take the time to provide us some feedback on if this session was helpful for you, as well as ideas for future content. We are very committed to providing the programming that's going to be most helpful to help small businesses weather this storm, and so we really need that feedback from you on what's going to be most useful. Also, if you haven't already put a note on your calendar, we have a town hall with Senator Bennett this Friday at 1:30 to talk about what on the federal level supports are being discussed and being efforts to put in place to support small businesses and recuperating from COVID. So we hope you'll join us for that. And again, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.